All right, welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating blueprint. It asks a big question. What if the systems we all rely on, governments, supply chains, the power grid, what if they just went away? Now, this isn't about some lone wolf survivalist fantasy. Far from it. This is about how a community could actually build a resilient, self-managed society right from the ground up.
So, to even start talking about this, we've got to bust two big myths that were always sold about what happens when things fall apart. First, you've got the Hollywood lie. You know the one. It's Mad Max, every person for themselves, fighting over the last can of beans. Then there's the other side of the coin, the bureaucratic lie. This is the one that tells us we're basically helpless children, just waiting for some far-off government agency to come and save us. But you know what? The thinking behind this whole architecture says both of those ideas, they're just completely wrong.
Okay, so if both of those are lies, then what's the truth? What's the real alternative? And that question, that's really the heart of this whole thing. See, this new architecture doesn't see collapse as some kind of apocalyptic ending. Not at all. It's more like the shedding of all the unnecessary, overly complicated stuff. It's the falling away of fragile systems. And what are you left with? Well, you're left with what actually matters: people, the community, and the land you're standing on. So how in the world do you start building something like this? Well, the very first design principle is all about how power is structured. And the key idea here is a fractal. Seriously, just picture a fern. You see how the tiniest little piece of the leaf looks exactly like the whole branch? That's the goal. A society that organizes itself with that same beautiful, resilient, repeating pattern, instead of, a rigid, fragile pyramid with one person at the top. And this leads us to a really cool concept called a heterarchy, which is basically the opposite of a hierarchy. So what does that mean? It means leadership is constantly shifting depending on what needs to be done. So say you need to repair a dam, the engineers are going to step up and lead, right? But the next day, if there's a medical emergency, that's what? The medics are in charge. Power isn't some permanent title. It's fluid. It's tied to who is the most competent person for the job right here, right now. Okay, so here's how that fractal idea actually works on the ground. It all starts with the smallest unit, the affinity group. Think of this as your small, trusted crew, maybe 5 to 20 people. Now, when a bigger project comes up that needs more hands, your group sends a delegate to a spokes council to coordinate with other groups. And this is the really critical part. That delegate is just a messenger. They're not a ruler. They're not a boss. Their job is just to coordinate. All the real decision-making power, it stays right there with the local groups.
Right. So this immediately brings up a huge question, doesn't it? If there are no permanent rulers, no bosses, how does anything get done? How do you make big decisions or, deal with conflict and crime? Let's dive into the mechanics of how you can actually govern without a government.
So this whole system really runs on a few core principles. First off, forget about majority rules voting. You know how that always creates winners and losers? Instead, this uses consensus. The goal is to make sure every single voice is heard and that everyone can live with the final decision. Then there's this idea of dual power. This is where the community just starts building its own stuff, its own water systems, its own power, its own food production, until the old external authorities just become, irrelevant. And for defense, security duties are rotated. This is so important because it prevents a permanent warrior class from ever forming and taking over.
And when we talk about justice, the whole mindset shifts away from punishment completely. So instead of thinking about jails and prisons, this model is built on something called transformative justice. The entire goal is to heal the harm that was done. It's about using mediation and restitution to repair the tear in the community's social fabric. It's about restoring balance for everyone involved, not just, blocking a problem in a box and throwing away the key.
All right, so we've got a structure for making decisions and handling conflict, but what about the economy? With no global supply chains, no dollars or euros, how do people actually get the things they need to live? Well, the answer means we have to completely, and I mean completely, rethink our relationship with stuff. I love this quote from the source material. It just nails the concept. Imagine a library, but for everything. A library for seeds, for tractors, for the land itself. You see, the core engine of this economy isn't a market, it's a commons. The big idea is that all the community's essential resources, the tools, the land, the collective knowledge, they're all managed together and they're available for everyone to use, just like you'd check out a book from the library. And that brings us to this really radical shift from our idea of private ownership to a logic called usufruct. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually super simple and powerful. It basically boils down to this. If you are using something and you're taking good care of it, it's yours, for now. But if you're not, it becomes available for someone else who needs it. It's all about prioritizing access and good stewardship over just hoarding things. So for actual exchange, it's not just one system. It's kind of like a layered toolkit. At the very foundation, for the absolute essentials like food and water, you have a gift economy. People just contribute what they can. Then, for other kinds of work, you have time banks, where an hour of your labor is worth an hour of someone else's. Period. An hour of childcare is valued exactly the same as an hour of construction. And finally, for things that aren't essentials, there's mutual credit, which is basically a currency the community creates and manages itself, totally bypassing any central banks. Okay, so we've talked about power, justice, and the economy. But now we get to what the source material calls the single hardest part of this entire blueprint. And it has nothing to do with building solar panels or figuring out water filtration. The hardest part? It's rebuilding ourselves. This quote just says it all, doesn't it? The most difficult architecture to build isn't a solar grid, it's the architecture of the human heart. Because you can have the most brilliant systems and structures in the world, but they're absolutely useless if the people living in them haven't made a deep internal shift. I mean, think about it. We've been trained for centuries to fit into these little boxes. You're either a master or a servant, a consumer or a boss. But true autonomy, well, that requires a completely different kind of human being. So how do you even begin to do that? The path forward is through a deep commitment to a different way of learning and being, what some call radical pedagogy. And the principles are pretty straightforward. First, decentralize knowledge. Share critical skills relentlessly. Because if only one person knows how to be a doctor, they effectively become a king. So the goal is for everyone to be both a teacher and a student. Second, you have to actively practice emotional resilience to deal with trauma and stress together. And last, and this one's huge, you have to consciously unlearn that deep-seated impulse to either be in charge or to be told what to do. But we have to be real about the challenges here. The sources are pretty upfront about what they call a silence in this blueprint. It all makes fantastic sense internally, right? But it doesn't give a complete answer to a really tough external question. What happens when your peaceful, self-managed community has a neighbor that's desperate or maybe even aggressive? And that really brings us to the most important takeaway of all. This vision of self-management, of autonomy, it's not about building higher walls to keep people out. It's not about an isolationist fantasy. The ultimate goal is to build a way of life that's so resilient, so abundant, that it can actually afford to be generous. It's about creating a model of connection so strong that your first instinct isn't to build a higher wall, but to build a larger table,